Thank you all for coming to today's inaugural Margaret Levy Lecture in Political Economy. At the SNF Agora's Institute for the Center for Economy and Society, we invigorate core debates about political economy across ideological lines. So many of our debates these days feel stuck, and we want to change that. We are, as my colleague Henry Farrell likes to say, weird. We don't color inside the box, and we don't want to. And I can't think of someone more fitting to name our new lecture series in political economy after than that free thinker, category breaker, and inveterate troublemaker, Margaret Levy. So you may know her as the world-acclaimed political scientist. She is the Jerry L. Bacharach Professor Emerita of International Studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington and a professor of political science at Stanford. She has written only a couple books, just a few, of Rule and Revenue, Consent, Dissent, and Patriotism in 1997, Analytic Narratives in 1998, Cooperation Without Trust in 2005, in the interest of others in 2013, and a Moral Political Economy in 2021. She has served as president of the American Political Science Association from 2004 to 2005. She is the recipient of the 2014 William H. Riker Prize for Political Science. Levy is the winner of the 2019 Johann Skytte Prize and the 2020 Falling Walls Prize. Oh, shoot. We're going to come back to my apologies. For Breakthrough of the Year in Social Science and Humanities. And she is also one of the foremost champions in the world for Aboriginal Australian art. For a decade, she oversaw the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, CASBS, at Stanford, where she turned a scholarly center into the center of the Big C conversation over what is power in our world today, that is, Silicon Valley. There, she audaciously orchestrated a collision of academic and business leaders to rethink the contours of digital capitalism. And while the rest of us were passively enamored by our beautiful iPhones, she was centering the question of how workers would fare in the digital world to come, long before it was fashionable to bash Elon. But despite all these West Coast achievements, all those fancy books, I know Margaret as a fellow Baltimorean. While she has spent most of her life on the West Coast, and I say it like that, West Coast, and in Silicon Valley, Baltimore is an indelible imprint on her work. Everything she writes carries the traces of this town's ethos. She wants a better world, but not at the cost of ignoring the world as it is. She knows that business growth matters, but not at the cost of working people. She is serious and perspicacious, but she's also personable and hilarious. She is the best that Baltimore can be. She is weird in every best possible way. And it is, I would argue, with Baltimore values that she comes to political economy. And that's why we've named this lecture series after her. From her earliest work, her concern has been with political economy. How can we use history and data to dislodge seemingly settled debates to better understand institutions, money, power, and outcomes? Her first major work, of Rule and Revenue, explored how rulers maximize their taxes, even though they are constrained, and summarized in one of my favorite sentences ever written in the English language was hers, which is simply, rulers rule. Period. Rulers rule, period. And the rest of the book extends that sentence to eventually being rulers rule, but not always as they would like. And this key question of how rulers rule and what we should do about it animates her vast body of work. She offers through these texts and today's talk a compelling vision of why we must be in this together and how to bring that about. She embodies the defiance of orthodoxy and the passion for progress that we at CES want to bring to the public. Please welcome Margaret Levy to give the inaugural Levy Lecture in Political Economy.
So when I learned that this lecture series was named after me, to my surprise and incredible honor. I, of course, immediately told my husband, Bob, and he said, "We didn't even give any money yet." Well, there is that possibility. Well, as Lewis said, I come from Baltimore and am proud of it. Went to high school here, used to come to Hopkins all the time. I went to public high schools, to Western High School when it was still on Howard Street. Came to Hopkins on numerous occasions, including to be I joined SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, and was in the Hopkins chapter since high schools didn't have chapters then of SDS. That was a long, long time ago, but I have never. So as I was saying, this is the first time, however, I've given a talk at Hopkins. So I'm really excited to do that and really pleased to. And of course, I love this center, which in principle, I am the head of the advisory committee, though, as far as I know, Steve, we have never met. You and I have met, but the advisory committee has not. I was asked to tie what I'm doing right now, the research and thinking I'm doing right now, to technology, since this talk is part, in principle, of a major conference workshop that's going on that Angus Bergen has organized, thinking about networks and technology. And I have done work on technology and thinking about its impact and how to control it and its uses, as well as its dangers and its problems. But my interest here and today is less about those large questions of technology and more about how it affects political action in terms of informing and disinforming people and mobilizing them. So you'll hear the talk isn't really about technology, but I'm going to weave technology and certainly networks into it. Let me start with a quote from the writer Zadie Smith to give you a sense of what I'm writing about. Sometimes the very act of seeking solidarity is characterized as, we've just been talking about it, the commons. And when I sit down to essay, ESSAY, this is Zadie Smith, I find it helpful to remind myself of the radical historical roots of that concept. I picture the blasted heath of the 19th century, a piece of open land that is about to be fenced in by the forces of capital, but upon which a large crowd has gathered, precisely to protest the coming enclosure. But not only that, a variety of overlapping causes are represented in that space, although they are all fundamentally concerned with freedom. Abolitionists, suffragists, trade unionists, working people, and the poor are present in abundance, alongside with some land reform radicals you might call socialist Christians. And yes, okay, a few old Chartists. Plus some anti-vaxxers, a smattering of Jacobites, and a couple of millenarians. That's the trouble with no fences. Anybody can turn up. Today on the Commons, all of these people have gathered to oppose a common enemy, the landowner. But disputation and debate are still everywhere, and you, the next speaker to get on the platform, must now decide how to address this huge crowd. Some rhetoric will definitely be necessary. You'll need to warm them up before you lay it on them. And you can never forget that all around you is an explosion of alterity. People with their own unique histories, traumas, memories, hopes, fears. But this multiplicity needn't shift your commitments. It may even intensify them. That's what I'm writing about right now. She sums it up very well in her recent New Yorker essay. She doesn't know about my work, so she's not summing that up, but she sums up the concerns that I have very well. What Zadie Smith is describing is an early step in the building of what I call an expanded and inclusive community of fate, F-A-T-E, not faith, but fate. A form of solidarity in which people recognize how their destinies are interconnected and thus are willing to act collectively in their own interest, but also to act in the interest of others, even others who can never reciprocate directly. Building and sustaining such a community of fate is a way of taking power over one's own future, but also of changing practices and policies that are blocking the achievement of common and shared goals. It requires 3 steps. First is the selection of an issue area framed so that individuals recognize that their destinies are entwined, that what affects one of them could affect all of them. Second are means for finding and linking those who share and recognize that common fate. Third is a set of governance arrangements that allow civil debate, even over intensely held differences in policy, and that facilitate solidarity and civic capacity. In other words, a community of fate can survive only if it is an organization with rules and structures. I explore how to build such an expanded and inclusive community of fate around care and caregiving. Framing, networks, and technology are key. So that's sort of the summary. But before proceeding, let me take a step back to put this into a larger context. Bob watches early morning television on Sunday. He particularly likes Fareed Zakaria, and there was a program on Disconnected Life in a Disrupted Digital Age. It included several speakers. The emphasis was on contemporary statistical findings by commentators such as Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge about the extent of loneliness and social isolation among the US population. They advocate changes in the regulation of social media and cell phone usage by children. Probably good things, but possibly not getting at the underlying problem. Robert Putnam, who was also featured, made a broader case, pointing to historical variation in social isolation over time. So he wasn't just being a presentist, as we've been talking about in our workshop. Pointing to historical variation in social isolation over the century predating the current technologies, leading him to search for additional causes. Putnam's concerns echoes that of David Brooks, Arlie Hochschild, and others, how we might connect with those like us and those who are different, and the circumstances facilitating such connection. While my interests mirror Putnam's to some extent, my focus is less on individuals, their choral societies, and soccer clubs. It appreciates these and other attempts to, as Brooks would say, weave a social fabric. However, my emphasis is on the structural and organizational conditions that make it possible for people to form networks and work together on a collective project that promotes the general welfare of society. My emphasis is less on how technology isolates us, which it certainly can do, than on how it might be used to unite us. I am far from a techno-optimist, but I do believe that technology can be made to work for us and not just on us. I echo some of Henry's thinking here as well. As should be clear already, one of my driving concerns in the past few years is how to create and sustain an expanded and inclusive community of faith, based on the recognition that our destinies are interconnected. John Alquist and I wrote a book, one of the ones that Henry mentioned, in 2013, attempting to explain why the West Coast Longshore Union, the International Longshore Workers Union, ILWU, and its counterpart in Australia, the Maritime Union of Australia, were able to stimulate pro-social collective behavior among their members. This meant willingness to take costly actions in the interest of others they might never meet or who might never be able to reciprocate. This was something the East Coast Longshore Workers Union and the Teamsters neither attempted nor could have achieved, even if they had wanted to. Our finding had to do with the combination of governance institutions, including direct democracy that emphasized participation and engagement, and socialization processes that educated the members about the world. These practices enhance the solidarity that was built on working together, and in the case of the ILU, coming together in person at the hiring hall for assignments, job assignments. The notion of community of fate echoes similar concepts used throughout the 20th century. Famously, Martin Luther King Jr. proclaimed, "We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." End of quotation. Similarly, the Knights of Labor, International Workers of the World, and the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers adopted as their motto, "An injury to one is an injury to all." A related but distinctive concept is Michael Dawson's notion of linked fate, in which one's life chances are entangled with a particular group, so a narrower, not an expanded community of fate. Since the publication of the book, I've been struggling with the questions it does not address. First, how to scale communities of fate beyond the unions, how to ensure they are inclusive as opposed to the exclusive forms such as Nazism or forms of nationalism. 3, our book presumed pre-existing organizations. So what are the kinds of organizations that can be the foundation for these expanded and inclusive communities of fate, the way the unions we studied were? 4, do such organizations already exist, and how best to link them and build from them? There are 2 additional questions to consider, questions that are front and center of a book on political equality I am currently working on with Tim Besley and Pablo Bermendi. Indeed, questions I have been worrying about since my undergraduate days as a student of Peter Bachrach at Bryn Mawr College. What are the power relations within the group, and how can they be structured to ensure non-dominance by any one set of actors over others when the group is making significant decisions that will affect them all? This is where networks, sometimes created through digital technologies, may contribute. They can help establish community. But they also embody power relationships that need to be interrogated and sometimes mitigated. That was the argument that my co-authors and I made, David Lee and John Seeley Brown and I made in a piece for the Bernholtz, Landemore, and Reich edited volume, Digital Technology and Democratic Theory. Other pieces also address these issues, obviously, and I should note that Henry was also part of that volume. What I want now is to take these ruminations to the problem of considering how care and caregiving might be used as the basis for an expanded community of fate. I will lay out, trying to make this bigger, sorry. And all I've done is go back to the beginning. Okay. Having trouble with my system these days. Give me 1 second here. Okay, I will lay out challenges, offer what insights we have, and suggest where we still need more research and thinking. So this is very much a work in process, mostly written over the last 2 weeks. So I'm still really trying to think it through, and I haven't really written it up yet. Most people share a belief in the duty of care for children, the frail elderly, the sick, the mentally or physically challenged. That duty is most likely to become a personal responsibility if the person requiring care is a blood relative or dear friend. But many may also feel obligations towards others in our society in need of care. Some of this instinct may be biological. Deborah Gordon provides multiple examples of cooperation and care in the insect world. And we know about it in the ape world, bonobos and the like. The tendency may be part biological and part social or cultural conditioning. Alloparenting, for example, exists in multiple societies over multiple eras. where grandparents or others become the adoptive parents, essentially taking care or being part of a network taking care of the young and sometimes the elderly. And sometimes the source may be societal alone. The motivation for welfare states is the obligation of a polity to ensure the well-being of all of its members. Although people may disagree intensely on who is deserving of attention personally or collectively, through the family or through the state or through private insurance, and we may diverge on how best to provide and pay for that care. Nonetheless, caring for and about others is a generally shared value. Certainly among the most important relations we have as individuals and as members of a society is that of caring, whether being taken care of by others or taking care of others. We've all been babies, and all of us have parents. Many of us are parents, and some of us, most of us hopefully, will grow old and frail or need health facilities. Bob and I can tell you the stories of that need. I see a few others who could too. Will require care and give care. We rely on each other, on organizations that insure us, and on organizations that provide for us. How we proceed must start from assumptions that guide evidence-based science, including social science and policy. As individuals, we must develop capacities, and we do this through a variety of relationships, some bilateral and some multilateral. Most people are members of social networks, participants in collective norm and skill-making processes. These relationships and networks are the source of our ethics, which we help affect and are affected by. Humans are in a complex ecosystem with each other, but also with their natural and technological environments that contribute to the formation of their ideas and norms, and including about care. Okay, so let's turn to the 3 steps in creating an expanded and inclusive community of faith. The first is establishing agreement on and recognizing a common destiny. So the first challenge is to construct a framing of the problem of care that cuts across political and other divides to produce recognition of interconnection and interdependencies. Even though care is a common and widely shared concern, the political polarization of the day often undermines its potential to bring people together in a mutual enterprise. Liberals tend to talk about the care economy, while conservatives emphasize family policy. Liberals tend to focus on government support and programs and on the workers, often low-wage and immigrant, on whom so many people rely for childcare, senior assistance, home and institutional health care, etc. Conservatives tend to emphasize the role of the family members and religion, both as a guide and as an institutional source of care. As some of us discussed this issue in preparation for a workshop that the center is supporting, we were trying to think about how to frame this that would cut across divides. In our conversation, Glory Liu immediately consulted ChatGPT, why would you not, for a framing that would not be left-coded. This is what the machine produced. Everyone at some point in life gives or receives care. Yet across the world, families, communities, and governments are struggling to meet these needs in a way that is affordable, sustainable, and effective. Aging populations, declining birth rates, and growing workforce shortage are creating new pressures on societies. At the same time, innovations in technology, housing, and service provision offer opportunities to reimagine how we organize care. This workshop, your workshop, Louis, brings together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to ask, how can we build infrastructures of care that strengthen families, sustain communities, and support economic vitality? By connecting diverse perspectives and highlighting practical innovations, we aim to generate ideas and networks that will guide policies and practices for decades to come. That was the machine, okay? It's not bad, all in all. but also not enough either rhetorically or practically. The rhetorical challenge still involves defining care. Some of the work focusing on the ethics of care has as much to do with caring about, demonstrating concern, than it does about caring for, the meaning I'm using here. I'm really concerned here about how we care for each other, not just how we worry about them. And even when we emphasize caring for, more questions than answers arise. Who is ultimately responsible in terms of making decisions, actually providing the needing services, paying the bills, etc.? What are the institutions and services and funds required to support the principal caregivers? What are the different skills required in taking care of someone else? And how do those skills vary when the cared for are children versus the disabled versus the frail elderly? There is also the question of emotional attachment and whether that is an essential ingredient in caregiving, which might eliminate robots if we think it is. Research exists on all these issues, and it should be attended to. Equally important is the fact that there are quite varying perspectives on the answers. Partisanship, religious affiliation, culture, gender, and age are among the many factors that determine how individuals think about these questions. So even though there may be a consensus that there is a duty of care, who it applies to and how it is best implemented could undermine the creation of a community of fate unless there are means developed for civil discourse about and resolution of differences among those with shared commitments. From the multiple studies of unions, religious organizations, if Hari was here, I would give her a hats off for her recent work on religious organizations, and communities, we know quite a bit about the conditions under which people recognize their interconnectedness despite difference. In some instances, this is because of common history, geography, and worldviews, often supported by shared religion and party affiliation, the kinds of communities Arlie Hochschild describes in her book on Louisiana. But the question here is how to identify the conditions under which people are likely to interact with those whose worldviews are very distinct. There is research here as well, which has been put into practice and embellished, most notably by people like Marshall Gans and by the Deliberative Democracy Lab run by James Fishkin, Larry Diamond, and their collaborators. They bring opposing political partisans together and engage them in a process that involves face-to-face discussion as a means of discovering their common humanity and then finding points of agreement, points of productive disagreement, and trustworthy procedures for becoming better informed. These are terrific real-world experiments, but as the formidable collective intelligence project started by Divya Siddath states in its white paper, we need new models of value elicitation, ways to develop scalable processes, those tend to be small groups, for surfacing and combining beliefs, goals, values, and preferences. The CIP list includes possible candidates such as quadratic voting, sortition, and other forms of deliberative democracy. Although there are problems with these approaches, as Henry and Hari point out in an excellent paper that Henry recently gave me, and as Henry and I are addressing in the piece we are doing, I applaud the attempt to discover points of commonality and compromise, while also ensuring recognition of the legitimization of opposing perspectives. The first step is implying some of these practices to issues of care. In most of these experiments, there is an implied and sometimes explicit recognition not only of differences in views, but also of inequalities in status and influence, a point I want to emphasize. Such inequalities can seriously undermine deliberation by creating deference among those who should be encouraged to speak up. In their research on networks and groups, Cecilia Ridgway and Sonia Nakagawa define, quote, low status deference as acceding to the judgments of higher status members in regard to group decisions, even when those judgments disagree with the low status member's own, an action that grants higher status members an influence and standing, it grants them influence and standing in the group. They measure deference by assessing through experimental and survey methods the expectations group members have of each other, as well as their self-assessments in regard to two distinct characteristics, status and competence. This method of assessing low status deference has been validated through multiple studies over time. Given that caregiving often involves low-paid, often immigrant workers and women, means of overcoming deference must be written into the process. So it's another thing that we have to solve. Ensuring that civility and respect cultivated in deliberative settings translates into a larger and enduring recognition of community of fate requires more than conversation, I would argue. And some of the advocates of deliberation would agree with me here. It requires an organizational structure. This is what John Alquist and I discovered in our work, and Hari Hahn and hers, to cite a few examples. I will return to this point later in talking about how to build capacity. But first, we need to find other members of the community of faith. If we've resolved the problem of the common destiny, how do we find the others who recognize and share it? And here technology does begin to play more of a role, as well as networks. Once the framing is established, it is then necessary to link people. The starting point for creating an expanded and inclusive community of faith is to build on organizations that already exist. I won't give a full catalog here, but a very partial list of U.S. organization includes National Alliance for Caregiving, Family Caregiver Alliance, Caring Across Generations, the Caregiver Action Network, Modern Family Institute, and others. More research is necessary on which of these organizations could become part of a network that would be a grounding for a larger community of faith, and more thinking has to go into the design of that network. Networks can also form without much prior organization and then be transformed into more organized and directed actions and even political and policy change. Technology can play an important role here in helping to form the network and providing scientific information, as well as helping people coordinate. A beautiful example of this is documented in the NPR, if it still remains funded, podcast Embedded, where the reporters track what began in Brazil and then spread to Ecuador, Mexico, and Argentina. It's a lot to learn from Latin America, not a weird country, instead of countries, and the other definition of weird. Somehow, the women who wanted abortions, which was a lot of women, which was highly illegal in Brazil, discovered in the 1980s that Cytotec, or misoprostol, which they called miso, a drug created to combat ulcers, is an abortifacient. They did this by reading the label on the drug. That was how they really discovered. The label said, "Do not take this if you are pregnant." So they figured, some experiment, they found that what it did was aborted, gave you a miscarriage, aborted the pregnancy. So through whispered word of mouth, because it was illegal to have any kind of abortion or to give information about it in Brazil, this was in the 1980s, they let others know that it worked. Although initially they didn't know how much was necessary to take, so they still sometimes ended up in the ER because of and needed curettage, because they were bleeding. But they didn't die, and they didn't need DNCs, which was happening. The percentage of female, a word I understand we are no longer allowed to use in government-funded grants, but the number of female deaths went down precipitously. Helplines sprang up in Brazil and in Ecuador to spread the word. And these were very organized networks. Mexican abortion groups created a movement that expanded and scaled the helplines. Their strategy was something called, I'm going to try to say this in Spanish, but my Spanish is terrible, acompañamiento, or accompaniment. I'm going to quote from the reporters here. Martinez says, Usually people translate accompanimiento as accompaniment. It's not a word you use in English very often, but in Spanish, you hear it all the time. It can mean being with someone, but also supporting them or just keeping them company. Estrada, I love the root of the word, which comes from the Latin cum panis. It means the people you break bread with, your companions, the people you trust. Martinez, and for abortion, it comes to mean being there during the whole process from beginning to end, regardless of the legal risks. So the accompaniers were engaging in costly political actions, as were the ones getting abortions. Helping anyone terminate a pregnancy in Mexico was illegal and came with serious jail time. But women continued to help each other, sharing and buying miso for each other and being there throughout the whole process of taking the pill, possibly bleeding or needing some help. There were doulas who were trained. There was a whole process. They didn't involve doctors. They did it themselves and increasingly for strangers and other women in need. They acted in the interest of others and created a community of faith around care for those in need of help. Oh, I have to sign in. Okay, I'm signed in. Good, fine. In Argentina, a woman named Ruth Zerbriggen took the accompaniment model and brought it together with the first responders or socorrista movement and really scaled it. Not only did they help other women and in need, they gathered data as they did it. They said they were very annoying to these women who were in need of abortions because they insisted that they had to take these very lengthy surveys, giving the socorristas incredible information about who was getting abortions, how they did it, what worked, what didn't work, what other kinds of assistance might be needed to support it. And they discovered that nearly 30% of referrals were coming from health professionals. That was one of the interesting findings. So they discovered that there was a group of health professionals who were willing to help and be there should some of these women have needs. So the socorristas found those professionals and brought them into the network to assist in getting advice and giving prescriptions and giving literal health care should there be a need for it. And in 2018, when the Argentinian Congress began to debate abortions, the socorristas testified with the stories they'd collected from the 20,000 abortions they'd accompanied. Most of them done safely and effectively in the home with miso, so self-managed abortions. Abortion became legal in Argentina in 2021, not really in large part because of the work of these women in these networks that started as networks of care and became networks of political action as well. These changes resulted from what started as a network, and yeah, as I just said, and they were done by women from all social classes and walks of life and from health professionals who could lose their licenses and face time in prison for what they were doing. It was a movement questioned and criticized initially by others who opposed abortion, who were for abortion, because of its reliance on illegal actions. But in the end, those skeptics, and perhaps more importantly, government decision makers, came around. In the same period, the US was going in the opposite direction politically and legally. And women here are now creating new forms of oppositional networks and actions. There was a lot of skepticism initially about miso and mifoprostein by the doctors who, because they could go to clinics and they could get the women to go to clinics legally, thought they should deal with actual abortions. And now some of the healthcare professionals have really come around to understand that self-managed abortions are perfectly safe as long as the proper information is given. So the oppositional movement in the US, interestingly enough, started this isn't surprising, in Texas, where the most restrictive legislation came in very early. And it was the Mexican Socorristas and Argentinian Socorristas who initially came to Texas to help the women, the American women in Texas, get the help they needed. Websites were developed with huge uptake to provide real information about self-managed abortion and to give people access to prescriptions, often mailed across state lines because there were state laws that made it illegal to get those drugs in those states. A group of safe, that is trustworthy health practitioners were made available as needed. Doctors and healthcare professionals who had been skeptical became convinced because of the evidence that was collected. Now, all are continuing to take risks, often serious risks, when they engage in these actions, given the political and legal environment. But there are now, as we know, more abortions than ever before, and certainly more than are self-managed rather than dependent on clinics which have been closed or made illegal. There's another interesting fact about building the American network I discovered in reading about these. It required the establishment of new norms among the women, the American women. While Latin American women had more of a history and culture of supporting each other in these kinds of networked ways, and so sort of took to the accompaniment movement very quickly, in America, the women tended, obviously there were exceptions to that, tended to treat it as a service. And so barked at the people who were providing help because it wasn't fast enough or just what they expected from a service they were paying for. And once it was done, they figured it was done, right? That was not how the accompaniment movement is supposed to develop. So changing the norms of the women to understand that you had to pay it forward, that was part of the process, that you helped others who needed it, was part of the process of creating this expanded and inclusive community of faith, inclusive of women at least, and male healthcare professionals, was part of the task of the network. So it was also creating norms. The creation of expanded inclusive community of faith requires more than focusing on an immediate need for care. However, it must also reach beyond those who already require care or are engaged in caregiving to those who one day will be. So again, it's a change in how we think about our obligations. The starting point may often be pre-existing networks and organizations where people already gather and are most likely to immediately recognize common interests, concerns, and goals: schools, unions, healthcare facilities, religious institutions. And then again, it depends on the development of norms of mutuality and paying it forward. It is also important to go beyond personal and existent relationships. But how to locate, link, and create the opportunity for reasoned discussion and debate across multiple jurisdictions and time zones? This is where technology can be extremely useful. We know of many instances in which online communities can complement live communities. But there are challenges. Some of these are technical. Not everyone has digital access or knowledge, which leads to power differences and fear of manipulation. Some are difficulties of coordinating across time zones. But perhaps the most daunting challenge has to do with building trust relations in the absence of sustained face-to-face contact. This is possible, if not easy, as revealed in research I and many others have done. Another option, of course, is to build new kinds of representative mechanisms that enable groups who recognize common interest to select an agent to voice their concerns in a collective assembly. Sortition might do this, but while the lottery ensures a variety of voices, it does not necessarily secure the voices of all relevant constituencies. Going on a little longer than I planned to, Louis. Do I have time to get to the last part? Is it okay with the rest of you if I go on? Okay. Okay, so the last piece of this is creating the capacity and social capital. How do we actually get it going and keep it going? And I'm going to bring in the organizational features here, what I understand of them so far. When dealing with issues of care, it is not sufficient to be linked in a community of faith. It is also necessary for the carer to have the skills and capacities to provide the care and for the goals of the cared for to be articulated. Both are problematic in different ways. The skills and capacities of the carer depend on training and resources, sometimes medical resources, that are often expensive, particularly if we're to provide them to everyone. Moreover, the understanding of what is best for children, the mentally and physically challenged, and the frail elderly changes over time with new knowledge and science, and it also varies across class, culture, and availability of family. The CASBIS Berkeley project on the social science of care and caregiving is one attempt to expand the scientific understanding of what is needed for caring. This and other such efforts also help to reveal appropriate goals for the cared for when they are unable to articulate those goals themselves. For small children, smaller than you guys, the emphasis is, well, the emphasis is still on development for you, but you once weren't able to tell that, and Audrey had to know that you needed that. For children, the emphasis is on development while keeping the child safe. For the mentally and physically challenged and the frail elderly, safety is also a concern, while equally important is ensuring autonomy and dignity. We saw a film in one of our CASBIS workshops of a father whose children, an elderly father whose children had just been there, and they had put up cameras all over the house so that when he fell, they would know about it instantly and be able, so their motivations were great. As soon as they left the house, the cameras picked him up on a really rickety ladder, taking down all of the cameras. Okay, so that was about building some understanding of what care and care is, but we also need human capital, which generally depends on educational and training processes outside the scope of the community of faith. What the community can do in this dimension is identify the required forms of human capital, generate pressure to provide the relevant training, ongoing training and retraining, and help formulate, demand, and enforce guardrails that protect the safety of both the cared for and the caregiver. Equally important is to recognize the pressure on caregivers. Human capital in this context also refers to the resources individuals need to provide adequate care. Here I think back to the argument of another of my mentors, Michael Lipsky. He characterized street-level bureaucrats as those asked to undertake Herculean tasks with insufficient material in training or supplies and insufficient emotional support. Often caregivers are family members, home health care providers, daycare staff, or residential facility employees. It is well documented that in too many of these instances, they are poorly compensated or prepared for the complex and draining roles they must take on. That leads us to thinking about social capital. Having the political and social clout for change requires social as well as human capital. I won't go through the origins of the concept, but the consensus is growing in the literature that social capital stands for the ability of actors to secure benefits by virtue in membership in social networks and other social structures. Social capital is a product of relationships and social connectedness. These relationships can be the strong bonds of family and close friends, but there is also, as Mark Granovetter compellingly demonstrates, strength of weak ties. Being embedded in a network provides access to and references for opportunities, and there are advantages to a widely dispersed, loose set of connections that increase the quality and availability of information and connections. Social capital can also be the source of norms that simultaneously constrain and empower behavior. Matthew Jackson labels this variant of social capital as community capital. the ability to sustain cooperative, aggregate, and welfare maximizing behavior in transacting, the running of institutions, the provision of public goods, the handling of commons and externalities, and or collective action within a community. He notes that this is the hardest form of social capital to study because it is embedded in norms that are features of a society. So how do we study social capital? Putnam used surveys that elicited information on membership, engagements, and interactions, as well as trust. While this approach gives us a useful descriptive account of changes in joining and participatory behavior, the surveys cannot capture the relationships that social capital fosters or inhibits. An alternative approach is network analysis, and here I cite your paper, Audrey, with Mike Ward and Kate Stovall. And I recommend that all people read that in the Annual Review of Political Science. By analyzing the structure of networks, it is possible to observe, predict, and even measure who will have greater access to information, opportunities, control, and structural autonomy, as Ronald Burt labels it. Network analysis also provides insight into power within the networks, especially when defined in terms of dependency relationships, as another of my collaborators, Karen Cook and Dick Emerson, defined it. Recent work in economics on networks from Matt Jackson, and Raj Chetty opens new pathways. Raj Chetty's lab on the social capital produced through neighborhood interactions has given us a lot of information about how these things work. Using data the team acquired from Facebook, the authors consider the means for increasing connectedness. The first is through programs such as busing and integration that increase exposure across classes. The second is by reducing friending bias. That is the tendency for people with low social economic status to befriend people with high social economic status at lower rates. They conclude that both mechanisms are essential and both are shaped by social structures and institutions and therefore can be influenced by policy changes. To summarize, networks help the individuals in the network find each other and connect, contribute to the ability to act collectively, and clarify power relationships within the networks. And that leads us finally to governance, and then at the end to government. Governance, as many of us understand, often inspired by Elinor Ostrom, governance structures are necessary to guide community decisions and regulate members' behavior, even in the commons, the place we began with the quotation from Zadie Smith's essay. The ones that John Alquist and I revealed in our union work include education and social processes, so everybody's in the same conversation and knows something about the world outside their own particular world, know something about the larger world. And some form of participatory democracy that allows for voice and accountability of those who have greater power within the network. This is an area worthy of deeper research. Of course, there is an industry of those investigating governance norms and rules in a variety of historical and contemporary settings. What we need is deep thinking of the particularities of governance in an expanded and inclusive community of faith around care and caregiving. So now let me turn to the final piece in the puzzle, which is the role of government. I'm looking at you, Steve. In some countries in the world, most notably those in Scandinavia, there is a commitment of resources and support through generous welfare states from pre-birth through dying. Other countries, even wealthy democracies, the US included, are far more miserly. They claim, as the current administration is, that such programs are first too expensive, as opposed to ballrooms, and second, more appropriately, the obligation of the family, perhaps with the help of the private sector through insurance, religious organizations, etc. Not surprisingly, I am of a different view. I lean towards the arguments in Klein and Thompson's Abundance, but not totally. Two of its themes I wholeheartedly endorse: the rethinking and refining of government regulations, for which Jen Palka makes the most eloquent and convincing case, and also a stronger focus on the supply side, as Steve Tellis, Sam Hammond, and Daniel Takash elaborate. And Steve has continued to develop that work. Silly and contradictory regulations developed as part of the Rube Goldberg construction of legislation often stand in the way of efficient care. While I understand why it might be dangerous for a staff member in a care facility to help a fallen elderly woman to her feet, it would be better for everyone, as well as more efficient and cheaper, to train the staff how to do this, which is both a regulatory and a supply issue, than to call emergency medical services every time a person falls, right? Which is what's been happening recently. An additional approach is to consider how best to structure the financing of care by government. Robert Frank, among others, offers an interesting taxing plan in the recent Daedalus issue on care. But there are other proposals to think about, which is an aim of the overall project and makes it fit with CES. So you will be happy to know that I'm now concluding. An expanded and inclusive community of faith is both possible and desirable as we try to build a world that serves all of us better, enables most of us to flourish. Care and caregiving can be an important principle around which to construct such a community of faith, but it requires more than a common set of concerns and needs. Its success and sustainability depends on the development of a governance structure that permits, even promotes civil argument, empowers actors while mitigating unhealthy power relationships, has a means for reaching collective decisions, and encourages actions in the interest of both oneself, one's own, and distant others who may or may not be able to reciprocate. Thank you. Is there time for questions or not? It's up to you. I'm happy to take them if there's time. Okay, good. Louis, maybe you could help with that. I didn't mean that you had to carry that around, but
Yeah.
if you could call on people, that
We're a
would be.
full service operation. Yeah. Oh.
Hi there. My name's Lee Vinsel, and I'm from Virginia Tech's Department of Science, Technology, and Society. So I had two quick questions. The first is I wondered if you'd ever bumped into Michelle Murphy's article, Unsettling Care, because I think you'd like it in a kind of troublemaking way, because in a lot of fields, I actually didn't hear this in your talk, but in a lot of fields, care has kind of just become like synonymous with good. When in fact, like a lot of care work's just a drag. So she talks about how, you can look at it just as labor. So I think it might be helpful for you. The real question I had is about kind of opening up new bipartisan conversations around this stuff. And I wondered just about one angle would be these kind of so-called new conservatives like Orrin Cass, like all these characters that J.D. Vance especially hangs out with, who are more open to things that look like the welfare state, as long as it's framed around the family, of course, right? But just kind of like those opportunities for maybe opening up new spaces, as long as we figure out, I don't know, ChatGPT or whoever figures out how to frame it, like the conversation correctly.
So on your first, that was, yes, I will look at that, but there is a lot of work on the labor in care, and I've done some of it myself. So that's a really important issue that has to be attended to, and that's why I want this to be an inclusive community of faith, because I'm including the care workers, and there are all kinds of care workers, and they have needs that have to be attended to. So they are, in a sense, street level bureaucrats too, highly exploited. And a lot of them are going to disappear from the United States, or already have, which is going to put a whole different set of pressures, both on those who remain and on the families who are in need of help and assistance in providing care to their members. On the bipartisan issue, I'm all for that. You know, and part of what we're struggling to do is, and trying to engage in our larger project, are people with a different perspective than most of us, which tends to lean left or liberal. And to make sure they are part of the conversation and that we're attending to the way they frame issues and think about it and the concerns they have. And as I said, there's never going to be a time, I don't think there'll ever be a time when there'll be total agreement among everybody about who's deserving of care, who should pay for the care, whether it should be done through insurance. I mean, different countries have different ways of dealing with this, just as that, as I was talking about, the augmentation movement has different norms involved in it in the Latin American case than necessarily in the American case. You may want to converge that, or you may just want to recognize difference. So it's a real conversation that has to take place, and we're trying to help construct that conversation.
Thank you so much. My name is Jeanette. I was so struck by your inclusion of transnational connections between Latin American women and American
North American women.
United States women, yes.
Yeah.
In terms of abortion care and abortion provision, because I've also really been struck over the past 5 to 10 years about the relative liberalization of abortion in Latin America, including Argentina and
Could you
Mexico.
hold the microphone a little closer?
Oh, yes.
Talk up a little. I'm little.
Oh, yeah.
I'm getting to be the free.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak up. I hope that's not too loud. I've been struck by the decriminalization of abortion in Latin America at the same time that in the United States the legalization of abortion is increasingly perilous. And so I'm wondering if you can talk more about transnational connections between the Latin American abortion movement and the US abortion movement. I'd be really interested.
I'd love to, but I think you've heard almost everything I know about it so far. But I do suggest you talk to Audrey Sachs after the talk, who knows a lot about that worldwide, and has been doing some really important work through the World Bank around caring for women.
Thank you so much. I found this really inspiring, so thanks. I was wondering, in thinking about communities of fate, how you would advise someone who's working in a community of fate to plan around like power, because I've been part of communities where, there's participatory balance of perspectives, and then how do you then advise or theorize how then that group could then talk to their legislators who ultimately, like we could sit around and talk about our goals for a long time and have a beautiful community, but I feel like there's then that question of like informing power, and I wondered about how you theorize that. And then also I was wondering where the stories of individual people can kind of build that pathos, like a story of a really inspiring person who does something amazing for someone who is hurting, I think can really mobilize action, and where stories of individuals fit.
Okay, so the first question really has to do about how to turn this into effective political power, right? The way the Argentinians did it was, of course, there was an opportunity created, and it was often just taking advantage of a political opening, a discussion of legislation. I think about in the US, for example, the discussion of domestic violence, where then Senator Biden, who was chair of the committee, brought a bunch of domestic, so this almost answers your other question too, brought victims of domestic violence to the hearings to tell their stories. And they were organized. I mean, I was part of how he could find them, but having them tell their stories to the legislators made it harder for them, the Congress people made it harder, senators made it harder for them to oppose the legislation. Some still did, but it opened up a space. So part of it is taking advantage of the political moments that exist. Part of it is, and then using narrative, which is a very important tool. And somebody like Marshall Gans, who is one of the great organizers and teaching of organizations in the world, or Hari Han's work on Indivisible, is using narratives as a way to transform the way we think about things and the kind of actions that are taken. But I also want to emphasize that it's not just taking advantage of opportunities. Opportunities can be created too. So if you build, I mean, I think about community of fate in the sense that I use it as the basis of a form of collective action that can then be used, in fact, to put pressure where pressure needs to be put. I mean, one of the things we're seeing in the United States right now is not sufficient collective action, in my view, from a variety of people for a variety of issues, not just for the ones I personally might care about. And so I think that creating this recognition that we're in it together helps people get the strength, the tools, the skills, the courage they need to act collectively. And I don't just mean demonstrations, but all kinds of ways of putting pressure on their representatives in a variety, whether it be city councils or state legislatures or Congress. And mobilizing votes, you know, where they're important.
a few questions then.
Okay, because I take too long, sorry.
Thanks for your talk. I was wondering, is there any reason that the Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe versus Wade and threw the right to abortion into some doubt in the United States, is there any reason not to view that as an outcome of the same type of process that you've just described? Which is to say, it is also a
Yes,
community of fate linked to care, which has gone through the process that you described.
absolutely.
And concluded that outcome. So, and then in that case, when you say it's desirable, is your evaluation of the desirability of this outcome, is that grounded ultimately in something other than the process itself, in the kind of actual materiality of the need that links the community of fate, or the rational interest, well understoodness of the outcome that is achieved? Or are you just willing to endorse communities of fate linked to care regardless of the outcome that they achieve?
You want me to wait for the next question? Ooh, okay.
Yeah, thanks. Two quick. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we might balance the interests within communities of fate, particularly within the care economy. I buy your sort of argument that the care sector can be a particularly strong source for a community of fate. I have a hypothesis, though, that it can also be one of the most conflicted areas of society, in part because it injects consumers who have really high stakes. So we're in the healthcare sector, we have low-wage workers who you discussed about, but we also have consumers who need life-saving care. We have for-profit hospitals, in schools, unions representing teachers often run up against the interests of children. So sort of like, how do we think about balancing those conflicts and interests? And then the second quick question is, can you point to us some organizations that you think are really on the front line of doing this type of work? Unions are sort of your reference point, and we know historically they're on the decline, but they were also a special type of organization because they had legal authority to solve collective action problems. And I just don't see other organizations that have the same types of qualities. But thank you.
That was 3 questions. You told me
Yeah, it was Steve.
but now I have to remember 4 questions.
So just really, I'll try and make this really quick. One thing that I don't really think came up here, and you referenced it a little bit, is pluralism, right? Which is, one, we just fundamentally disagree about whether certain things are or are not care, right? So the most obvious example of that is what people for a while were calling gender affirming care, right? Which some people thought was obviously care and other people thought was abuse. And in fact, there's international differences even among professionals as to how they think about that. And then the other was just your example of the elderly guy with all the cameras, right? He had a disagreement about whether he wanted to be cared for, right? And whether that was care or it was simply surveillance and manipulation. And so I think the real question I wanted to get to is, how do you manage that really deep difference as to whether or not some things are care or abuse or manipulation, in a context in which you also want people to be engaging in sharing? Can you actually have sharing when you have that deep a disagreement about what constitutes care?
These are great questions, and they're the really, Louis, I can answer them now, right?
Yeah, you have 3 minutes.
Well, I'm going to punt anyway, because they're really tough questions and they are the key questions. So in each of them, my answer, my very short answer, really has to do with finding the right governance arrangements to do this. And I don't know what they are. And they're going to vary from organization and from problem to problem. So, I mean, I started the talk by saying, you know, I don't want this. We've got to find arrangements that make sure these don't turn into nationalism, Nazism. And I think your case is an interesting case because, yes, communities of faith can develop around all kinds of things, and I may disagree with some of them. I have to think about where I really stand on that as a social scientist as opposed to as an individual with my, yes, I may be helping to create, but we know that's true. I mean, you know, collective action can be used for anything, right? The question of, I mean, both of your questions really had to do with arbitrating very intense differences of perspective, and yours did too, to a certain extent. And there are, you know, there's a lot of experimentation going on. And this is the paper that Henry and I are actually working on or beginning to work on, is thinking about how to look at the experiments that are actually existing in the world right now to resolve some of these kinds of issues and to find some cases that might give us some hint, just as the union case gave us some ideas about how you might act in the interest of distant others, not just around the things that you were legally empowered to find collective decisions too. They learned some tools that way, but that wasn't what they were about. So, you know, we need some guidance. So my work is always a bit deductive and a bit inductive. And so I'm now at that point where I'm just trying to find some of the cases that would give us good examples. I mean, I was so excited to find the accompaniment case, which I literally just learned about like a week and a half ago. So, you know, we've been doing other things and I've been trying to get that into here. So those are the kinds of cases I'm looking for in a way that give us some idea about how these things can be managed and managed in different, very different contexts. So, you know, I'm talking about care. And as many of you have already pointed out, that care covers a lot of different things. And they have very different requirements in how they should be organized and managed. So I'm punting.
Perfect.